come on.
Yeah, great. I'm just gonna switch over. Well, first I'll let you see my face for a moment. I guess you'll be able to see it as I'm going through some of what I want to share. So I'm gonna just get those first slides up for you.
Perfect. And while Rose is doing that, just want to thank everyone for joining again this evening. I know, especially in the month of September, school starting, things are a bit crazy. So we're excited that you're here to join us. As you all know, Rose Chaffee-Cohen is going to be presenting. She was a Teach Earth Fellow 2 years ago up in the Arctic, studying climate change at the Arctic's edge with Dr. Leanne Fishback. And so she's going to be sharing how she's been integrating that into her biology classroom in Summit, New Jersey. So we're really excited to have her here tonight. For those of you who've done the webinars in the past, just type in the chat box any questions you have, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A or any comments or anything like that. So feel free to either chat throughout or at the end, and we'll get those answered for you. And a few other quick notes before we get started. Just so you all are aware, the Teach Earth Fellowship and the Project Kindle Fellowships have both opened up for the 2018 summer. So I'll start sharing links to that if you want to share that with your networks, anyone who's interested. And I also reached out about a week or two ago. We do have now this community shared database where we've been sharing lots of different resources and lesson plans. I'll send the link in the chat box, but I also sent out earlier that Rose has a sheet of different resources as well for you all tonight. So if you're interested in checking out that database and you haven't done so already, just send me an email and I'm happy to get you set up on that. So I will now pass it over to Rose.
Great, thanks. And Lucy, you're recording this for later. Okay, so if anyone has to leave early.
Exactly.
Great. So thank you for having me, Earthwatch. Basically, I wanted to share my goals first, and then we can jump right in. And as Lucy said, we'll save some time for questions at the end. And so I wanted to share my personal experience with trying to include more climate change lessons in my biology curriculum. I'm going to share some examples of lessons that we did. And as Lucy said, there's a resource page to get you started too. And my experiences at a K through 12 school for girls in Summit, New Jersey, and I'm teaching 9th grade biology. But I'm hoping that, you know, the challenges and opportunities that came up in this project are something that could be a model for similar approaches in your division or your subject area. So as Lucy said, I'll just, a quick summary of kind of how I got into this idea. I did participate in 2016 and got to travel to Churchill, Manitoba, and learn more about how climate change was affecting amphibians there. Part of my motivation was I've always been interested in the topic of climate change, but I also wanted to just learn about field methods and scientific research and kind of the skills that scientists are using that, I could talk about it from a firsthand point of view in my classroom. And as I was there, I would say some of the biggest takeaways were the dramatic effects that climate change was having on the Arctic in particular, and how those impacts are kind of accelerated maybe compared to others that we might expect. And then the other part was, as you all have done, is designing my action plan. So part of what I thought I could do was to look at the bio-curriculum that really wasn't doing anything to teach climate change. I was only seeing students in my environmental science classes really getting that kind of specific targeted education. And I thought we could do a better job of including that topic for all of the students that went through our science program, not just the section of environmental students that I had each year. So just in terms of kind of how I got started and brought my action plan to life, I knew that my department chair was really trying to get all of our classes to move towards more skill-based work. And so I thought that I could emphasize that by the types of lessons I wanted to do, we could introduce those skills. So we could help students see how their curriculum was relevant to real world issues. I could help them make connections between different topics and ideas throughout the year. And we could do different critical thinking or data analysis along the way, using climate change as our example, but kind of employing those skills that we wanted them to have in any discipline. Luckily, he was a supportive chair in that sense. And then I had to talk to my team. So I was not teaching biology alone, but I was teaching it with 2 other faculty members. So one of them I knew was really interested in climate change. So he was an easy person to have buy in. The other person, I sort of had to pitch it to them and, be enthusiastic and tell them that it wasn't necessarily going to mean a whole lot more work. So I was willing to kind of help bring the resources to our team and help us create these lessons. And so I think it was, to me, that's one lesson in terms of working on a team and bringing a new project is like, you have to be willing maybe to put in that little extra boost and to keep the team engaged with the idea throughout the year and not lose sight of it. But also when they have ideas or when you're looking for a new article, ask them to share anything in the next couple weeks, like that you find relating, say, DNA to climate change, and then coming back together, picking the best one. So I think that kind of teamwork was helpful to keep people along for the ride. And then the other thing was that we wanted to keep it manageable. So, we didn't say, okay, every single chapter, we're going to do something related to climate change. But we said, okay, we're going to make sure that this first year that we do it, maybe we have 3 or 4 lessons that we try to fit in. And we tried not to just, have a separate climate change unit or not to, just sort of like tag things in throughout the year, but we really tried to connect them to existing curriculum that were already there. And so when we were doing something with photosynthesis, we would use it as an opportunity to review or extend something that we'd already talked about, or to tie in those skills to the specific content area. And one of the things that I think we had to do with our students once, we were ready to start our first lesson was I explicitly told them, hey, we think that this is an important issue that all of you need to be thinking about. And so we're going to prioritize it. And, we're doing this lesson today and we're going to get started with talking about the nature of science and climate change dialogue and things like that. But then later we'll come back to it, with subsequent lessons, and we'll kind of keep coming back to this issue of climate change. So, sometimes we had these explicit lessons, and then other times we could just in class when we were thinking of examples, like, how are isotopes like relevant? We could talk about how they're used in ice cores and evaluating Earth's atmosphere at different times. So we could kind of come back to it because they knew it was something that they would continue to see again. So the other piece of this might have been, I know sometimes people are concerned, well, what about those students who might be resistant to the idea of climate change? And the place that I come from is this is a science course, and the scientific consensus, and I provide resources to look at this idea, but the scientific consensus is that climate change is happening and that it is human enhanced. And those are really not disputed in the scientific community as a whole, and also not really disputed outside the US in the same way that we see in our political climate here. So I kind of come at it from that point of view, and I ask them to accept those 2 pieces, acknowledging that some of what we know about predictions and how fast they'll happen, where we'll see certain effects, that's a little more debatable, or how we address the problem. That's something that is not uniform in our approach. So that's kind of where we start. So I'm going to go through 3 different lessons that we used in our bio curriculum. On the slides, I don't have all the details of the lesson included, but they are on the resource page, so you can look at them further. And so one of the first places we started was to look at terminology that's used in the media or in everyday kind of language versus how it's used in science. And so we wanted to tie in this idea of uncertainty, because uncertainty is kind of a thing that most people generally are not so comfortable with. We want to know answers definitively. But in science, uncertainty is embedded. It's just part of the process of science. And we try to minimize uncertainty, but a scientist generally knows you can't eliminate uncertainty. And so we looked at this by using a primary source. And so while this is probably more appropriate for high school students, I think the idea of going back to primary sources is an interesting one. And so we used the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's through the UN, and thousands of scientists work on this report. And the idea here, and I'll show you two different images from that lesson, was to both talk about how that public perception could vary from scientific understanding, and why it's important for them as citizens to be scientifically literate. But also later in the next slide, I'll show you we're introducing some of the predicted impacts of climate change, some which have been seen and some of which we're looking at what's the likelihood of seeing them in the future. So I presented them with this image from the IPCC report that sort of shows them how some of these predictions, what language we're using around them. So, some of the predictions, it says, okay, let's say a certain amount of sea level rise is very likely. What does that mean? That sounds like, okay, well, maybe it's going to happen. It's pretty likely, but really here it means 90 to 100% probability. And so when you look at that statistically, you might have a different impression of how much we know about that prediction. At the top, you can also see the chart that sort of talks about how the confidence changes depending on both the evidence, like the amount and the type of evidence, that kind of thing, and then as well as like scientific consensus and how that shapes some of these terms as well. And so in terms of skills in science class, we often talk about like the nature of science. And so, sort of applying that to see like how are real scientists talking about uncertainty. And we came back to that several times in the year when we would do labs and sort of talk about how good is our data, how can we minimize uncertainty and things like that. So, oops, I guess I didn't have that next picture. But if you go to the lesson, you'll see that the next image that students were presented with was a table of these predictions that I talked about. And what degree of likelihood there would be for, say, sea level rise, increased storm intensity, things like that. And students had prompts that they went through. So it wasn't me necessarily guiding them through this discussion as like a lecturer, but them in groups talking through these things, asking questions like, how do we measure agreement? What does it mean for data to be robust? Because that's some of the terminology that's used here. And also thinking about how does understanding or misunderstanding of science affect our public perception of climate change, right? So thinking about why is it important for them to be scientifically literate? So the second time we came back to a specific lesson on climate change, we were connecting it to work that we had done with photosynthesis. And so in this case, we wanted to help them make connections between what they had learned about photosynthesis and some other topics like symbiosis, chemical equations, and systems. Again, they kind of received prompts that guided them through questions to consider. And we also were introducing another impact of climate change that they hadn't talked about previously, so coral bleaching and ocean acidification. And so in terms of skills here, one of the things we looked at were different graphical representations of information and how we could read those and what information it conveys well and what information, it could be misleading or could be represented in a better way. So they could look at, say, this graph of coral bleaching, and yes, it does show that as the temperature of oceans are rising, we are seeing like certain coral events happening, but it's not really a wholly just a cause and effect, as the graph kind of implies. And so after that, we looked at other theories for how why coral bleaching might be happening. And there's various kind of lines of evidence for what could be increasing coral bleaching events. And we kind of evaluated those and talked about how the science is sort of still unsettled exactly on what is the biggest contributing factor, but that it's likely that global increases in ocean temperatures have some relationship to that. And so one other thing I think that might be helpful to know is that, a lot of these lessons were meant to reinforce topics. We weren't always teaching something that was completely new. And so, students could work at their own pace, and then I could just stop in and check in with individual groups and probe their thinking a little bit more. And it wasn't something that had to, have an entire class conversation, or that if a student missed it, we had to make it up with them necessarily. So it was kind of a flexible thing. We could fit it into a time period that kind of worked for us. So, anytime sort of towards the end of the unit when we felt like we wanted to we spend about 20, 30 minutes on each of these lessons, we could kind of be flexible about that. So the last one that I'll share with you was utilizing our study of DNA. And so I found this article about guinea pigs. The headline's kind of interesting. Guinea pigs beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA. And the point of the lesson that we did with this article was to sort of look at how scientific findings are communicated in popular media, and then interpreting or comparing that with like the primary source, the journal article. And, what is the difference? How do some of these articles for, the average person sometimes inflate the meaning or interpret it slightly differently? Is that always bad? And that kind of stuff. We also wanted to show them a journal article and what it looked like, because, we often talk about peer review, but we don't always get to like really dig into that and see that and what does that mean. So in this case, we had this popular article that they read, and then we went to the journal article and we focused mostly on just the abstract, and kind of used that as a way to both connect to DNA vocabulary, some of which we had seen, and then some new stuff that came out of the abstract, and to just sort of engage with that primary source. And so in this case, I'd also emphasize that the lessons were pretty low stakes, as I said before. It wasn't something that was graded or felt like they were being assessed. But what that also meant was that higher level students could really dig into some of this stuff that was a little more challenging. And then average students could take away something that was more appropriate to their level. So it felt like something that was pretty flexible based on the student. So in this case, we went to the abstract, which is a little bit intimidating when you start reading. It's been color coded for the activity that we did with them. So in this case, the terminology was at a pretty high level once we started to unpack it. But the average student might feel comfortable just with this idea of like comparing news articles to journal articles and kind of what the difference is there. So the types of activities that we did with these readings were like, so in this case, I broke groups up, and each group had one colored segment where they had to kind of do some research and interpret. So they were looking for, okay, when I get to the term epigenetic, let's look up that and see if we can make more meaning from my section. But first do a general reading and see like what overall is this saying. Okay, now let me go back to the vocabulary and see if I can identify more. And then come back to the group and go through and kind of summarize like what is this section saying, and try to make meaning and understand what did the experiment look like? What were they trying to find? What did they find? And a lot of the terms we had encountered in different places because we had already studied cell division. We had already done stuff with genetics, and now we're at the place of looking at DNA molecules. So they actually knew a surprising amount, I think, to them, and they just needed to unpack those really challenging terms. But some other ways that, you could do it where just to sort of look for general meaning, read through with general meaning, really just focus on those new pieces of terminology. That could be another way to go about it. Or even just going through and highlighting what are the terms that you do know from past study. Let's kind of see, where's our starting place. They didn't necessarily need to know every term in the abstract to get an overall sense for the experiment. But I think that it helped them make connections between those different units that we had studied and kind of seeing how a scientist was applying those concepts in this experiment. So that's kind of a look at 3 lessons that we did for just connecting what already existed in our curriculum to climate change. As I said, I shared a resource list with a lot of other things that people could utilize, either for teaching. Let's say there's things for climate refugees, there's materials to look at sea level rise and maps, and if you're interested in kind of looking at interactive animations, there's things like that. And then I included also some other curriculums that are out there, some of which kind of could connect to work in the humanities as well. So the Facing the Future curriculum might be something that would be useful too. So I want to save some time and just see, what questions might come up for you. I know you may have been posting some of them in the chat box, but I can't really see that while I was sharing my slides. And so I'd be, available for any questions or comments, or if you want to share other resources with each other, you can also use the chat box for that.
Great, thank you, Rose. So now, if anyone has any questions, just feel free, as we said, to type them in the chat box, and we'll start sharing them off here and answering them. And you should all see the resource page now in the chat box as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll wait for those questions, but I would also add, for example, in AP Environmental Science, I do a lot more with giving them a lot of background on earth science, like systems, and, why carbon dioxide, what are the sources, what are the effects, and things like that. And so in this case, like I said, we didn't really have a place to put a climate change unit in our existing curriculum. So we thought, well, what are the ways that we can kind of start to just give them more exposure to talking about climate change, because it is around them and they're seeing it in the news and things like that. So, and a lot of them are open to the fact that it's real.
It looks like Kristen wrote a question here. What kinds of challenges did you face as you sold your team on the project you were introducing, and how did you negotiate those with them?
Yeah, I think in my case, I actually had faculty that were fairly open to this idea, partly because one of them was a newer teacher to the school, and the other, as I said, had his own interest in climate change. But maybe also strategically, picking that group that I wanted to work with, because I've worked with more challenging teachers in other teams before, and maybe that it wouldn't be where I would start. But as I said, I think part of the success might have been that I was willing to do a little bit extra, especially at the very beginning, to make the lesson design happen. So a lot of times I would say, hey, I found this article related to this. What do you think? Let's talk about it. Okay, next time we meet, I'll have a draft of the lesson. We'll look at it together and see what you think. So both being willing to get that started, but also staying open to feedback and input from them, so they felt like there was some ownership as well.
I'll give one more minute in case anyone else has a question.
I think that I'm just gonna, riff on it, other things that might be helpful to know or think about, and feel free again to add more questions. But I think that there's also an opportunity to just look at where can you use an example related to climate change for a concept that you're already teaching about. So as I mentioned, like something like isotopes that you teach in chemistry, using examples of how ice cores measure different isotopes, and that allows them to predict past climates. That can be something that you're introducing and showing how it's relevant, and it's kind of cool to see those ice cores and for students to know, oh, like this isn't just an esoteric topic that I'm learning about. And so I think there's some other, other areas that you could do that too. Like, for example, with the chemical reactions, I'm sort of a chemistry on the brain because I'm working on that this year. But with the choral lesson, we did something with the chemical reaction between, I think it was between carbon dioxide and ocean water, and then also how it affected like calcium carbonate formation. So we use that equation, and they don't necessarily need to know like all of those formulas and how that transformation happens in the reaction, because these were ninth graders, but they knew some pieces and they knew how to look at a chemical equation. So we kind of used it to guide them through some other prompts about reactions that were relevant to their level.
Any comments or conversations from or with the community and parents about teaching climate change? For example, denying it, supporting the evidence, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I haven't had a lot of parent resistance in the past, and I think part of that is just the nature of the community, the school community that I'm in. But I know that I've had a diversity of students' political affiliations. Mostly I'm thinking about environmental science class, where we end up talking about it a lot more. And as I said, the way that I really approach that is to be firm about the science where there is definitive consensus. And I can, and have, if you need to, resources that help articulate that. One of the resources I shared on the document was from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I actually find them to be useful in terms of like how scientists talk about climate change evolved as they need to better articulate themselves to the public too. But I do leave room for those places where there is more uncertainty, and we talk about that. As I said, like certain predictions about effects have a little less certainty around them, and some of them more so than others. So, but also the approaches that we take to solving them, that's something that seems more relevant to political discourse. I also emphasize that this type of debate is really only prevalent in the United States, and globally there isn't as much of a discussion. It's pretty well accepted that climate change is happening and that humans are enhancing it. So I think it's interesting to look at maybe how it's different in other countries compared to us and ask, why is that? So those are some things, that might be helpful as you think about that issue.
And then Bridget was wondering if you or anyone else who's joining tonight has a resource that gives the ratio of isotopes in ice cores. She was thinking about making cores in graduated cylinders.
I'm not sure about that, but I feel like perhaps the NASA website on climate change could have some information related to that. I don't think it would be something that would be that hard to find as far as the ratio. I don't know about making them. I've never tried that or seen any lessons about that. It sounds cool, but I don't know anything about how that's done.
Bridget, you could also try posting that on our teacher's Facebook page, and maybe you'll get some responses from different people on that if you're looking for. Well, it doesn't seem like we have any more questions here. So if there's anything else you want to say, Rose, otherwise we'll wrap up now. But you did just get a comment. It's great to see what cool things you've been up to.
Yeah, I included my email. Well, I don't know if it's actually, it is on the resource document, so you can feel free to email if you have questions or if you find another cool resource that I could check out. And, you know, I hope that you all, you know, keep working on bringing climate change education to our students.
Great. And I'll just wrap up with one more comment that just came in saying thanks for the presentation and really enjoyed the idea of looking at climate change from a global perspective and how countries are responding.
Yeah, there's some cool maps out there too. I'm not sure if I included them on the resource page, but there's a climate hot map, which shows different impacts on different countries around the world in sort of a semi-interactive map. And I've also seen similar maps with sustainability solutions that are being applied around the world too. Yeah, so that's a great thing because we are not necessarily the leaders on climate action. And so a lot of things are happening at local levels or at different countries.
Great. Well, thank you again, Rose, for the presentation, and thanks to everyone who carved some time out of busy September to join. I will be posting this on YouTube later this week and sharing it around email and Facebook. So if you want to go back to it or you jumped on late or want to share it with other teachers in your network from your fellowship, I'll be sharing the link there. And stay tuned. Our next one will be with Kristen Jovial, who's on tonight at the end of October. So I'll be sharing some information about that coming up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.